In the final days of October 1942, the wide Pacific did not feel open at all for the American Navy. It felt tight and dangerous, a place where one mistake could erase an entire campaign. Out in those restless waters moved a single battered aircraft carrier named Enterprise. She had already taken part in the great clashes at Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and the Santa Cruz Islands. Each battle had left new scars on her steel. Bombs had smashed through her decks, fires had run across her planking, and shock waves had bent her frames. Yet the ship still moved, her engines pushing her south toward the anchorage of Noumea in New Caledonia. Seen from a distance on that 30th of October, Enterprise did not look like a clean symbol of power. Dark burns marked the spots where flames had raged days earlier. One bomb had punched through the flight deck near the bow, leaving twisted structure and patched holes. Near misses had slammed into the sea beside her and shaken her hull so violently that plates along her sides no longer lined up straight. Inside, pumps labored to keep ahead of small leaks, and sailors passed through dim, humid passageways checking bulkheads and valves. The carrier had become a list of problems that needed to be fixed quickly. She was more than a ship. She was the last operational American fleet carrier in the Central Pacific War Zone, and if she could not be returned to fighting shape, the entire effort around Guadalcanal would stand on very thin ice. Among the men aboard, one officer carried a special responsibility for keeping the wounded giant alive. His name was Herschel Albert Smith, the damage control officer. Years earlier, he had graduated from the Naval Academy and then spent his career learning the hard, unglamorous details of ship survival. He studied blueprints, crawled through machinery spaces, and walked miles of piping runs. Over time, he learned the path of every fire main, the position of each pump, the way fuel and fresh water flowed through the hull, and the likely weak spots when explosions shook the ship. By 1942, Smith was less a simple officer and more a walking map of Enterprise. From the start of the war, he had insisted on constant drills. Crews practiced sealing off compartments, rigging hoses, setting shoring timbers, and clearing smoke-filled spaces. Sailors groaned at the endless exercises, but Smith did not bend. He knew that when a bomb exploded close by, hands would shake and minds would blur. Only training repeated again and again could push men to act correctly in those first seconds when survival hung in the balance. During the battles at the Eastern Solomons and the Santa Cruz Islands, that preparation had proven its worth. Fires had been contained, flooding slowed, and the ship had stayed afloat and able to fight. Now, as Enterprise eased into Noumea, Smith faced a new test. This time the wounds were not coming in one sudden wave. They were already there, spread across the hull, demanding deep repair in very little time. Noumea itself was a rough forward base, not a polished homeyard. The anchorage lay in a sheltered harbor surrounded by hills, with long lines of fuel tanks, supply depots, and workshops crowding the shoreline. Ships came and went constantly, bringing men and equipment toward the struggle for Guadalcanal. There were no towering permanent dry docks or huge foundries, but there was something else that mattered just as much. Construction battalion units, the CB builders, worked here, ready to turn raw steel and timber into whatever the fleet needed. For Enterprise, about 75 of these builders were assigned directly to the carrier the moment she tied up. Work began even before all lines were fully secured. Repair parties cut and hauled plate, dragging heavy pieces of steel along narrow walkways. Cranes swung jagged fragments of damaged structure away while new pieces came aboard. Welders lowered their masks, struck arcs, and poured heat into seams, filling cracks and joining patches over torn sections. Their lights flared in sudden bursts along the flank of the carrier, bright against the fading paint and burn marks. On the flight deck, carpenters and metal workers moved around bomb craters, measuring, cutting, and fastening temporary patches to create a smoother surface for aircraft wheels. Smith refused to sit behind a desk. He moved endlessly, climbing ladders, ducking through hatches, and checking everything with his own eyes. 1 hour he might be deep in a machinery space looking at a damaged pump. The next he would be on the hangar deck checking fire mains or inspecting new shoring around bent frames. He listened to every suggestion, but he always measured it against his central aim. The ship did not need to look pretty. She needed to be safe enough to sail, strong enough to take more punishment, and functional enough to launch, arm, and recover aircraft. Anything that did not serve that goal could wait. All the while, news from the wider war pressed in on Noumea. Reports from Guadalcanal spoke of heavy fighting on land and rising enemy activity at sea. Japanese forces continued to push ships and troops down the long channel of water known to the sailors as the Slot, hoping to break the American grip on the island. Control of Guadalcanal meant control of the vital sea routes between the mainland of North America and Australia. If the enemy managed to land fresh reinforcements in strength and to silence the airfield known as Henderson Field, the entire strategic position in the South Pacific could tip against the Allies. Every new message about enemy movement cut another slice off the time available for repairs. Life around the harbor matched this urgency. From the decks of nearby ships or from the piers, observers could see Enterprise dominating the waterfront, long and gray, surrounded by small craft and barges. During the day, hammer strikes echoed from within her hull, and showers of sparks fell where cutting torches bit into bent metal. At night, the glare of welding arcs scattered across her sides like brief white stars, rising and fading as the CB teams moved from one break to the next. The scene made it clear that the carrier was not resting. She was being forced back into shape as quickly as human hands and tools could manage. For the crew, there was little separation between normal duties and repair work. Sailors who usually served as deck handlers or gunners now hauled beams, fetched tools, or helped rig temporary supports. Those many hours of damage control drills under Smith now showed their worth in a different way. Men knew how to move in cramped, smoky spaces, how to brace a bent bulkhead, and how to work in low light with hoses, boards, and steel plates. They were tired from months of combat patrols and sudden alarms, yet the sense that they were working on the only available fleet carrier in the region pushed them to keep going. Smith himself ran on determination more than sleep. Meals came in short breaks, cleaned up quickly so he could return to the work lists. In his mind he carried a running picture of the ship, with sections marked as safe, risky, or not yet checked. Some fuel tanks would stay empty for now. Certain compartments would remain sealed, written off until a proper shipyard could be reached. The forward elevator, smashed and twisted, could not be made usable in the short window they had. The carrier would leave Noumea still carrying serious wounds. The only real question was whether she could perform her core tasks long enough to influence the next battles. Day by day, the answer moved closer to yes, but never completely. For every repaired crack there seemed to be a new weak point uncovered nearby. Flooding had been stopped in some areas, yet piping runs still needed rerouting and tests showed that certain systems remained fragile. Still, progress was clear. The hull grew more watertight. The flight deck became smoother. Aircraft engines roared to life as maintenance crews ran tests. Ammunition crews checked hoists and storage spaces. The ship was beginning to look less like a victim and more like a fighter being patched up between rounds. Out beyond the harbor, the enemy did not wait. Night surface actions and air raids around Guadalcanal hinted that a major effort was coming. In that atmosphere, no one in Noumea believed that Enterprise would be allowed to sit idle. A moment approached when the captain, Osborne Hardison, would have to make a decision based on the judgment of his damage control officer. When he turned to Herschel Smith and asked for a clear answer on whether the carrier could go back into battle, that single reply would send the wounded ship either towards safety far to the rear or straight back into the line of fire where the fate of the Guadalcanal campaign would be decided. The question had been hanging over Enterprise from the moment she slid alongside the pier at Noumea. Every weld, every patch of steel, every length of hose laid out along a passageway was really part of the same quiet decision. Either the carrier would be pushed back into the line, or she would be sent deep to the rear for months of slow repair. No one needed to say the words out loud. The crew understood that the answer would be shaped by the judgment of one man who knew the ship's wounds better than anyone else on board, Herschel Smith. As he walked the length of the vessel, Smith carried more than the fresh damage in his mind. He also carried memories of earlier battles when the carrier had seemed to stand on the edge of destruction and had somehow pulled back. Months before Noumea, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, he had watched enemy bombs fall closer and closer, sending columns of water high into the air and hammering the hull with shock waves. Fires had broken out, and there were moments when smoke rolled through passageways so thick that men could barely see each other. Yet the drills he had forced on the crew had taken over. Valves were spun shut in the right order. Fire mains stayed alive. Flooding stayed under control. The ship had come out of that test with new dents and scars, but still able to operate. Later, at the Santa Cruz Islands, the strain had been even worse. Dive bombers had plunged out of the sky and found their mark, one bomb blasting a deep wound into the flight deck and others sending shock through the steel from bow to stern. On those days the ship had felt like a living thing trying not to collapse. In the middle of that chaos, Smith had moved from fire to fire, from flooded compartment to damaged machinery space, pushing teams to act faster than fear. Pumps had been brought online, hoses laid out like veins across the decks, and shoring timbers jammed into place against groaning bulkheads. Each time a new damage report had come in, he had weighed his options in seconds and chosen the least bad path to keep the carrier alive. Those earlier trials had not been forgotten when Enterprise lay in Noumea. If anything, they made the situation more urgent. The ship had already burned through a great deal of luck and skill. Her crew knew how quickly a single bomb or torpedo could change everything. At the same time, those earlier escapes had proven that, with the right preparation and leadership, a battered carrier could survive punishment most observers would have assumed fatal. In a way, Noumea was not only about plates and welds. It was about whether that streak of survival could be stretched further without finally snapping. As the days passed, the tempo of work only grew. Repair parties no longer felt as if they were fixing a static object. Enterprise was slowly turning from a wounded patient back into a warship that expected to move. Shored-up sections were checked again to confirm they would tolerate the vibration of high-speed steaming. Temporary reinforcements were added in spots that had seemed adequate at first but now looked thin under closer inspection. Fuel lines were pressure tested while men took notes on which tanks could safely be filled and which would remain off-limits. The construction battalion builders stayed at it around the clock. Their torches carved clean edges into jagged metal so that new patches would seat properly. Where large holes had gaped in the side of the hull, they now laid in heavy plates, sealing them with long lines of weld that ran like bright scars across the gray surface. On the flight deck, the most dangerous craters were now covered, but they kept working to smooth the surface further, adding braces underneath and double-checking that arresting gear would hold the strain of landing aircraft. For all the visible effort topside, at least as much work went unseen in the bowels of the ship, where Smith's teams traced pipe runs and cables by the light of swinging lamps. News from Guadalcanal arrived in short, sober reports. Japanese forces were not backing away. Convoys of transports and groups of heavy warships were again pushing south, trying to force a decision around the island. The Marines holding the line near Henderson Field were still under constant pressure. Each new message suggested that a decisive effort by the enemy was close at hand. For the sailors in Noumea, it was impossible to ignore the connection. If Enterprise did not go forward soon, there might be no carrier air group available in time to strike at the incoming enemy forces. Inside the captain's cabin and the wardroom, officers studied charts that showed the positions of friendly cruisers and destroyers, the location of enemy bases, and the long stretch of sea between Noumea and Guadalcanal. They mapped out possible routes and speeds, trying to balance urgency with the risks of sending a damaged ship too fast through waters where submarines might be waiting. All of those calculations, though, depended on a simpler foundation. They needed to know if the carrier could handle hard steaming and combat operations without falling apart. Only one person could give a credible answer to that, and everyone knew who it was. When the moment finally came, it did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived because time had run down almost to nothing. Smith had spent another long tour through key compartments, spoken with construction battalion foremen, and listened to his own petty officers describe the latest test runs. The picture was not comforting, but it was clear. The hull was sound enough to risk the journey. The remaining leaks could be managed. The forward elevator was a loss, but the other systems that mattered for launching and landing aircraft were functional, if still vulnerable. Damage control reserves were thinner than he would have liked. Some spaces remained shut tight, a reminder that this was still a wounded ship. Once Enterprise cleared the shelter of Noumea and aimed her bow north, the ocean around her felt different. Behind her lay the harbor lights and the harsh flicker of welding arcs. Ahead lay a stretch of water sailors had started calling the slot, a long, narrow route used by enemy warships and transports pushing down toward Guadalcanal. The ship moved at fighting speed now, engines driving hard despite the patches and fresh welds in her hull. Every vibration was a reminder that she was still healing, but also that she was alive. Up on the flight deck, the signs of recent damage were impossible to miss. Some areas showed new plates that caught the light in different shades than the older metal. The forward elevator remained a dead spot, a silent testimony to the bomb that had smashed through it at Santa Cruz. Yet the rest of the deck had been turned back into a working runway. Crewmen checked arresting wires, rolled bombs into place on wheeled carts, and lined up stacks of ammunition. Fighters and dive bombers stood nose to tail, lashed down against the wind, their fuselages marked by earlier missions in the campaign. The air group that had flown through Midway and the Eastern Solomons had lost men and machines, but the core remained. They knew the waters ahead. Below that deck, in the heart of the ship, Herschel Smith treated the voyage as the opening act of another emergency. He walked long routes through the carrier, checking everything he had promised would work. Fire stations needed full hose racks and charged lines. Portable pumps had to be fueled and ready to move at a moment's notice. Electrical boards, already battered by past shock, had to be steady enough to handle the strain of battle power. Wherever he went, he carried the same quiet insistence that had driven the drills back in calmer months. A tool left lying loose was not just untidy. It was a future hazard when the ship began to lurch under impact. Near him, construction battalion workers who had stayed aboard after Noumea moved in smaller teams than before. Their days of huge plates and roaring cranes were over. Now their work focused on fine adjustments. They checked weld seams that might be stressed by the constant pounding of the waves. They added extra brackets here and there, small pieces of insurance against metal that might shift under shock. To many of them, this was a strange new stage of the job. Repairs were continuing on a ship that did not wait in harbor but surged toward a fight, carrying them along into the same danger as the regular crew. As the carrier pushed farther north, the flow of information from the wider battlefront grew more intense. Radio rooms and flag plots filled with reports from patrol aircraft, coast watchers, and submarines. Enemy forces were on the move. Japanese battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transports were gathering, their paths all pointing toward the waters off Guadalcanal. At night, the slot turned into a deadly arena for surface ships, with heavy guns and torpedoes trading blows in close, chaotic clashes. By day, aircraft would have their turn. Enterprise was steaming to be present when that day came. For the men on board, the sense of being the only available fleet carrier in the region sank in with each passing hour. There were other Allied ships scattered across the theater, but none with the combination of speed, striking power, and experience that Enterprise possessed. She had become a kind of moving spear point, expected to throw her air group at the densest knots of enemy power. The crew did not dwell on grand strategy when they carried bombs or checked valves. Still, the knowledge sat in the back of their minds. If this ship failed, there would be no ready replacement waiting just over the horizon. The rhythm of life at sea settled into a tense routine. Dawn and dusk became the most critical periods, when enemy aircraft might appear out of the glow along the horizon and when scouts would launch in search of new threats. Pilots studied maps of the islands around Guadalcanal, learning the outlines of coasts, bays, and channels they might have to navigate if they were forced to ditch or land away from the carrier. The names of places like Savo Island and Iron Bottom Sound, already stained by earlier losses, hung in the air as warnings of what could happen if the enemy broke through again. Smith spent these days tightening the web of readiness inside the ship. He walked through damage control stations and asked simple questions. Where would this hose run if a bomb hit near the bow? How would this team reach a burning space in the hangar if one passageway was blocked? Which watertight doors had to stay closed as a matter of habit, even when no alarm sounded? He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The memory of past fires and flooding gave his words all the force they needed. The crew had seen what happened when unprepared hands met real disaster. They preferred his drills to repeating that experience. Weather played its own part in the advance. Some days dawned with low clouds and showers that cut visibility to short distances. On those mornings, Enterprise felt like a large, vulnerable target moving through a gray world, its lookouts straining to see unseen threats. Other days opened clear, the sky a bright canopy over a hard blue sea. Those were better for flying, but also better for enemy bombers and scouts. The carrier's escorts, cruisers and destroyers spread around her, kept careful patrol, their own radars and lookouts scanning for the first hint of incoming aircraft or fast, low shapes on the water that might be torpedoes. As they closed in on the region around Guadalcanal, the signs of ongoing conflict increased. The radio carried fragments of surface action reports from nights when Allied cruisers and destroyers collided with enemy ships in short, violent brawls. News of damage, sinkings, and heavy casualties came in blunt phrases. The men aboard Enterprise understood what those words meant in human terms. They had friends on some of those ships. They had replenished fuel or traded stories with crews that now, after a few fierce minutes of gunfire and explosions near the island, were gone to the bottom. All this built a steady pressure, but the crew also knew that their own turn would come not in the dark close-range battles of the slot, but in the broad daylight strikes of carrier aviation. Somewhere ahead lay the moment when scouts would report enemy positions close enough for Enterprise to launch a full attack. That moment would call for everything the ship had left to give. Fighters would have to clear the sky of enemy planes. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers would have to press in on heavy ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Each attack run would carry the risk of never returning to the deck that had launched them. Smith prepared his teams for that day as if it were a certainty, not just a possibility. He checked the stocks of firefighting foam and dry chemicals. He verified that rescue teams had stretchers ready, bandages at hand, and clear paths through important corridors. He walked through the hangar bay, where aircraft would be fueled and armed, and imagined lines of fire running through spilled fuel or dropped ordnance. Everywhere he looked he searched for ways to cut off those chains of disaster before they could start. In his mind, countless invisible routes of destruction were already laid out. His aim was to block as many of them as human effort allowed. When at last the island silhouettes of the Southern Solomons appeared on the horizon, they did not look like heroic landmarks. They were dark shapes rising from a sea that had already swallowed many ships. Guadalcanal itself lay behind those outlines, holding the embattled airfield and the men who had been fighting for every ridge and river line for months. Enterprise took her place in the shifting formation of Allied ships supporting that tenuous foothold. From that vantage point, the crew could not see the trenches or foxholes ashore. They could not see the exhausted Marines and soldiers watching the sky, hoping that friendly aircraft would appear when the next enemy push came. But they knew the stories. They had heard how transport after transport had slipped down the slot to land fresh troops for the opposing side. They understood that the coming clash would likely decide whether those supply lines stayed open or were cut. The tension reached a new level as scouts went out and did not return on schedule. Each delay hinted at contact with enemy forces. Each partial report suggested that heavy ships and transports were gathering beyond the edge of clear sight. In the ready rooms, pilots sat with their gear close at hand, going over target photos and attack plans one more time. On the bridge and in the flag spaces, officers weighed incomplete maps of enemy movement and tried to guess where the decisive blows would have to fall. On the lower decks, where there were no windows and only the thrum of machinery and the murmur of voices carried through the steel, Smith and his teams waited for the first sound that would tell them the next battle had begun. It might be the dull thud of anti-aircraft guns opening up in the distance, or the close, shattering crash of a bomb finding the ship. It might be the steady roar of aircraft launching in full strike packages. Whatever form it took, they knew it was coming. Enterprise had left Noumea not to cruise, but to throw herself into this moment. As one day near Guadalcanal drew toward its crucial morning, the carrier's decks braced for action. Crews secured every loose item. Airmen strapped into their aircraft. Lookouts scanned the sky with renewed focus. Deep inside the carrier, Herschel Smith checked his watch, listened to the hum of pumps and fans, and felt the entire structure around him poised between its recent past as a wounded survivor and its immediate future as the main striking arm in a battle that would shape the course of the war in the South Pacific. Dawn came gray and uneasy over the waters near Guadalcanal. Low clouds streaked the sky, and the sea rolled in long swells under Enterprise as she took her place in the loose ring of Allied ships supporting the island. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay transport convoys and heavy warships pushing down from the north. Somewhere ashore, men in muddy foxholes watched that same sky and wondered if help would arrive in time. On the carrier's flight deck, the answer to that question was lined up in rows of metal and canvas, waiting for engines to turn and propellers to bite the air. With the first light, the pace on Enterprise shifted from steady preparation to the sharp rhythm of combat operations. Ground crews moved around the aircraft in set patterns, hooking bombs under wings, checking fuel caps, and securing panels. The patch deck, still bearing the scars of earlier battles, now became a moving stage as handlers eased planes into position. The faint smell of hot oil and aviation fuel began to mingle with the salt air. On the bridge, officers watched the wind and the ship's speed, because every launch would depend on those details being exactly right. When the first planes thundered down the deck and lifted off into the pale sky, the carrier felt once more like what she had been built to be, a floating airfield taking the fight far beyond the range of her own guns. Fighters went out to guard the fleet and the island below. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers prepared for longer missions, waiting for scouts to find something worth the risk of a full strike. The sound of departing aircraft rolled through the hull, a deep vibration that reached even the lowest compartments where men could not see the sky but knew exactly what that noise meant. Reports from the island quickly confirmed that the battle for Guadalcanal was reaching a new pitch. Enemy aircraft probed the defenses, testing the reactions of the Marines and the airmen at Henderson Field. Transports had unloaded fresh Japanese troops on previous nights, and more were expected. Long-range scouts began to bring back sketchy pictures of enemy formations forming to the north, heavy ships and transports gathering like storm clouds along a distant front. The shape of the coming confrontation was becoming clearer with each hour. On Enterprise, the tempo did not allow anyone much time to think about the bigger picture in grand terms. For the air crews, each launch meant a climb into a sky that might be filled with flak and enemy fighters. For the deck crews, each landing meant catching returning aircraft on a deck that could not afford new damage. For Herschel Smith and his damage control teams below decks, each alarm meant a fresh test of the work done at Noumea. The ship was about to prove whether those hurried welds and patches could endure the strain of sustained air operations and possible enemy hits. As the day advanced, the first real test came when scouts confirmed the presence of enemy ships moving within range. The picture was still incomplete, yet it was enough. Heavy units were closing on the waters around Guadalcanal, and they would have to be met. Strike groups were ordered to stand by. In the ready spaces, pilots went over their target information one last time and checked their gear in quick, practiced motions. On the hangar deck, bombs and torpedoes were moved into position for loading, their fins and casings catching the electric light as they rolled. The air of anticipation grew thick but remained quiet. There was no need for speeches. Out at sea, the enemy made its own move. Night surface battles erupted around the island as Allied cruisers and destroyers collided with columns of Japanese ships in close quarters. Gunfire, torpedo wakes, and explosions tore through the darkness. By morning, both sides had ships sunk or crippled, and wreckage drifted in the waters near Savo Island. Among the enemy losses were heavy units that had tried to bombard Henderson Field into rubble. Yet the threat was far from over. Other ships lingered within reach, and transports still aimed to push reinforcements ashore. When daylight again spread across the water, it was Enterprise's turn to add her weight to the fight. Orders went out. Strike aircraft were brought up from the hangar and spotted forward on the deck. Teams worked with swift precision to arm each bomber and torpedo plane with the right load. The patched deck creaked and shuddered under the combined weight of metal and ordnance. Below, Smith listened to the rising tempo and checked that every fire main was pressurized, that repair lockers were stocked, and that his teams were in place near the most vulnerable zones. Scouts soon confirmed a major prize. A damaged Japanese battleship, hurt in the night action but still afloat, was making her slow way through the waters not far from Guadalcanal, screened by escorts. If that ship could reach safety and return later, she would again add her heavy guns to the bombardment of the island. If she could be sunk now, the pressure on the Marines ashore and the Allied ships nearby would ease. The choice was simple. Enterprise would send her air group to finish the job. The launch that followed turned the carrier into a machine of motion and noise. Aircraft rolled in tight sequence, engines howling as they raced down the patched lane of deck and lifted into the air one after another. Sailors on the deck watched each one rise and vanish into the brightness ahead, knowing that several of those silhouettes might not return. From the bridge down to the engineering spaces, every man aboard felt the ship grow lighter as the planes left, and yet the sense of risk grew heavier. With so much of her striking power in the air, the carrier herself was more exposed if enemy planes appeared over the horizon. Far above the sea, the strike groups formed up and pushed toward the reported position of the wounded battleship and her escorts. They flew over the same waters that had claimed so many ships already in this campaign, waters later called Iron Bottom Sound. Beneath their wings, the wakes of smaller vessels traced pale lines on the surface. On the horizon, dark shapes resolved into the outlines of cruisers, destroyers, and the damaged giant they had been sent to destroy. When the attack began, it unfolded in layers. Fighters moved to keep enemy aircraft away and to distract anti-aircraft gunners. Dive bombers peeled off from altitude, plunging down in steep angles toward the battleship, their wings trembling under the strain. Torpedo aircraft swept in lower, committing themselves to straight runs that would carry them close to the wall of fire rising from the enemy formation. Each pilot below the clouds faced the same choice. Hold steady just a little longer for a better shot or break away and live another day but leave the target unbroken. Many chose to hold steady. Enterprise herself could not see the impacts, but she heard about them in fragments as aircraft radioed quick reports amid static and interference. Columns of water and fire rose around the enemy ships. Some bombs found their mark on decks and superstructures. Torpedoes ran true and exploded against hulls that had already been loosened by the strain of the night's fighting. The damaged battleship staggered under the blows, leaving a trail of smoke and slowing further as critical systems failed. Escorts took hits as well, their decks torn, their formations broken. For the men aboard Enterprise, the tension reached its own peak during the long minutes between the last attack run and the first signs of returning aircraft. The flight deck crew stared into the hazy distance, waiting for the dark dots that would slowly grow into familiar shapes. Below, Smith's teams braced for any word of incoming wounded planes or damage from enemy counterstrikes. The ship felt like a coiled spring, charged with the strain of not knowing how many of her air crews had survived and whether the enemy had been dealt a serious enough blow. One by one, aircraft did come back, some trailing smoke, some with holes punched through wings and fuselages, some missing altogether. The deck crews moved quickly to recover them, catching them on the arresting wires, clearing the deck, and making room for the next battered machine to land. Mechanics swarmed over the survivors, patching what they could and pushing the worst cases aside. Pilots who climbed down from their cockpits carried in their faces the story of what they had seen. Without needing to speak, the crew understood that the enemy had been hurt badly, but not completely stripped of strength. As reports were pieced together, it became clear that the damaged battleship had been left in a state from which she was unlikely to escape. Later confirmation would show that she did not survive the day. The threat of her heavy guns returning to bombard Guadalcanal had been removed. Yet the larger storm was still gathering. Other enemy battleships and cruisers were on the move. More transports loaded with troops and equipment were pressing down the slot, aiming to land a force that could still tip the balance ashore. In the dim compartments deep within Enterprise, Herschel Smith listened to the summary of the strike and marked it in his own way. The ship had launched heavy attacks and recovered many of her planes without major new damage to herself. The welds from Noumea had held through high-speed steaming and the pounding of battle operations. But he knew this was only the opening act of what lay ahead. The enemy still had fresh ships and thousands of soldiers waiting to be carried toward Guadalcanal's shores. Above him, on the bridge and in the plotting rooms, officers studied fresh reports and tried to read the intent of the opposing fleet. The day's victory over the crippled battleship had bought a little space, perhaps saved the island from one more night of shellfire, but it had not stopped the larger effort. Another wave of enemy power was closing in, bringing with it more heavy guns and laden transports. Enterprise had proven she could still land heavy blows. Now the question that hung unspoken over her decks was whether she and her air group could strike repeatedly and hard enough to break the heart of the enemy attempt before those transports spilled their human cargo onto the contested shores of Guadalcanal. The first success against the wounded battleship did not bring quiet to the waters around Guadalcanal. It brought a tense, waiting stillness, the kind that settles before a larger storm. Enterprise and the ships around her knew that the enemy had not yet played all its cards. Heavy units still prowled to the north. Transports packed with soldiers and supplies still moved down the long route the sailors called the slot. The Marines ashore were still holding a narrow grip on the island, and the airfield at Henderson was still a prize both sides were willing to bleed for. As new reports filtered in, the picture sharpened. Enemy forces were splitting their effort. Battleships and cruisers prepared to drive in under cover of darkness to bombard the island, while transports followed behind to land fresh troops and equipment. Night had become the enemy's ally. Under the cover of darkness, heavy guns could rake the airfield and the surrounding positions, trying to burn out the fragile American hold. By daylight, whatever survived ashore would have to face fresh waves of infantry who had crossed the sea while the sky was too dark for carrier aircraft to hunt them. The Allied command understood this pattern and knew it had to be broken. Surface ships would meet the night attackers as best they could, fighting at close range among the islands. Enterprise would carry the weight of daylight, using her air group to attack the ships that had survived the night and to tear apart the transports before they could deliver too much strength to the island. In that combined effort, every hour and every intact aircraft would count. On board Enterprise, the thought of these looming night battles added a grim edge to the day's work. The crew knew that friendly cruisers and destroyers would soon steam into another violent clash among the islands around Savo. Some of those ships had already lost friends and companions in earlier fights there. The waters were gaining a reputation as a graveyard for steel, a stretch that would later be called Iron Bottom Sound. The knowledge that comrades were going into that darkness added pressure to make every daylight strike from the carrier count. If the air group could cripple or slow enemy forces before night fell, it might spare Allied ships from facing an overwhelming weight of guns in the narrow waters. As the afternoon wore on, scouts reported more enemy movement, not just a single damaged giant but multiple warships and transports working their way toward Guadalcanal. Some were still beyond easy reach. Others drew closer with each passing hour. Enterprise's airmen and deck crews felt the demand rising. They had already launched heavy strikes that day, but there was no space for rest. Aircraft were refueled and rearmed. Mechanics patched new holes with whatever materials and time allowed, turning battered planes back into workable tools in a matter of minutes. Deep below, Herschel Smith watched the strain on the ship build. High-speed steaming, frequent turns into the wind to launch and recover aircraft, and the constant shudder of operations all pressed against the welds and supports put in place at Noumea. So far, the hull had responded well, flexing but not failing. Still, he saw evidence of how thin their margin remained. A valve here developed a fresh leak and had to be quickly tightened. A length of pipe there vibrated more than it should and needed extra bracing. None of these problems were dramatic on their own, but they reminded him that Enterprise was not a fully healed vessel. She was a fighter held together by skill and will. As daylight faded, the carrier moved to a safer distance from the island, staying close enough to support operations but far enough to reduce the risk of sudden surface attack in the dark. Escorts tightened their ring around her. On the bridge, officers tracked the movement of Allied cruisers and destroyers that had been ordered into the night battles near Savo. Those ships would face enemy battleships and cruisers in ranges so short that searchlights and burning vessels would provide most of the illumination. There would be little room for error. Through the long night that followed, reports came back in uneven bursts. Enemy battleships had driven in and shelled the island, but they had also taken heavy punishment from Allied ships that fought at close quarters despite terrible losses. Hulls were torn open, masts shattered, and decks turned into tangled wreckage. Some Allied ships went down fighting, their names added to the growing list of sacrifices in those waters. Yet the enemy's effort did not go unscathed. One of their own battleships was left crippled and exposed near Guadalcanal, while other units took hits that left them smoking and slowed. When the first light of a new day crept over the horizon, it revealed a scattered and wounded enemy force strung out around the island. Here was a damaged cruiser trying to limp away. There was a battleship still wallowing in the swells, her steering uncertain and her decks scorched. Beyond them, transports pressed on toward the island or loitered nearby, hoping to complete their landings before the sky turned fully bright and hostile. It was the kind of scene carrier aviators trained for, a field of vulnerable targets left in the open after violent night actions. Enterprise did not hesitate. Orders went out to launch new strikes, this time aimed not just at a single damaged battleship, but at a broader swath of enemy strength. Dive bombers were assigned to go after cruisers and that wounded capital ship. Torpedo planes and other bombers were directed toward transports and destroyers. Fighters would cover the strikes and guard the fleet against enemy aircraft still operating from distant bases. The carrier's repaired deck thrummed under the combined weight of takeoff runs as waves of aircraft clawed their way into the air. As the strike groups fanned out toward their assigned targets, Herschel Smith returned to his familiar pattern of preparation and quiet worry below decks. The ship was again at maximum strain. Fuel lines were feeding aviation tanks at a steady pace. Magazines were moving bombs and ammunition up through the lifts. Heat from engines and machinery seeped into the passageways. In that environment, a single spark in the wrong place could start a chain of events that might undo everything Noumea had bought them. Smith walked the line between readiness and overload, checking that safety systems stayed active even under the rush of combat operations. Above, the air war concentrated its fire on the wounded enemy. The damaged battleship that had survived the night found herself once more under attack from the sky. Dive bombers rolled into their steep plunges, aiming at decks already weakened and torn by earlier blows. Each impact drove more steel into twisted shapes, set new fires, and punched new holes below the waterline. Around her, a heavy cruiser that had opposed Allied forces also drew punishment. Bombs found their mark, detonating with force that ripped open vital compartments. In the chaos of explosions and smoke, the foundations of an entire enemy task group were being chipped away. At the same time, the transports that carried thousands of enemy soldiers could not escape notice. Some had already managed to throw troops and equipment ashore. Others hovered offshore or moved slowly along the coast, thick with men and cargo still waiting to reach land. For them, the sight of carrier aircraft descending in attack formations meant the beginning of disaster. Bombs dropped from altitude crashed into holds crowded with supplies. Near misses close along the waterline split plates and let in the sea. Many of those ships would end the day beached, burning, or sinking in shallow water, their decks scattered with wreckage and their holds turned into traps for the very reinforcements they had meant to deliver. From Enterprise's perspective, the full scale of the destruction was hard to see at once. Reports came back in fragments as aircraft returned with fuel low or ammunition spent. Yet as more planes landed and more pilots gave their brief accounts, a pattern emerged. An enemy cruiser was gone, rolled over and sunk under the combined effects of bombs and damage from the earlier night fight. The crippled battleship no longer posed a serious threat, raked again and again until she could not stay afloat. Several transports had been torn open and sunk or left stranded ashore in ruins. Many of the soldiers they carried never reached the fight inland. For the men on the island, the result showed itself in a different form. Fewer shells screamed down on Henderson Field. Fewer enemy units arrived in organized fashion along the front lines. The pressure on the marine defenses remained brutal, but the scale of the reinforcements coming against them had been cut down by what Enterprise and the Allied surface ships had done in those critical days. Out at sea, the carrier could not see the foxholes or the muddy trails, but her crew understood that each ship they sank or crippled meant fewer rifles and guns turned against the men ashore. Back on Enterprise, the aftermath of the strikes filled the hangar deck and workshops with activity. Damaged planes rolled in, some missing landing gear, some scarred by shrapnel, some with bullet holes stitched across their wings. Crews moved in swarms, patching what could be salvaged and setting aside airframes that were too ruined to fix quickly. Every aircraft returned to service increased the chances that they could meet the next enemy move with enough force. No one assumed the battle was over. The enemy had already shown a willingness to throw ship after ship into the struggle for Guadalcanal. Herschel Smith felt that same caution. The Welds had held through more launches, more landings, and long hours at high speed. The patch deck had endured heavy use. Yet the ship was not magically renewed. She was wearing down in new ways. Pumps ran almost constantly. Steel flexed under repeated stress cycles. Men were tired, working on the edge of their endurance. As he checked his damage control outfits and the condition of key systems, he could sense how fine the line had become between a functioning warship and a breakdown that might come at the worst possible moment. Even so, the tide of the struggle around Guadalcanal had begun to move in a new direction. The enemy's plan to crush the island with a powerful combination of night bombardment and massed reinforcements had been blunted. Heavy units lay on the bottom or were limping away. Transports that should have poured thousands of soldiers onto the beaches now lay as charred hulks or twisted skeletons along the coast. Enterprise had stood in the center of that change, throwing her worn but still deadly air group into each opening as it appeared. Still, the sense aboard the carrier was not one of triumph. It was closer to cautious relief, edged with the knowledge that a single bad break could undo much of what had been gained. Enemy submarines still prowled the approaches. Land-based bombers could still reach out from distant fields. Another attempt at reinforcement might follow if the opposing commanders judged they still had enough strength left. The crew of Enterprise had no control over those decisions. What they could control was how ready their ship remained for the next demand placed on it. As evening shadows lengthened again over the island and the surrounding sea, Enterprise turned slowly through her assigned patrol patterns, her decks quieter for the moment but far from relaxed. The steel underfoot bore the marks of long days of battle flight operations. The men walking those decks carried in their muscles and their thoughts the weight of constant strain. Deep inside the carrier, Herschel Smith made another round of inspections, listening to pumps, feeling the vibration through bulkheads, and noting every small warning sign that the ship still carried in her battered frame. The great question that had haunted Noumea had been partly answered. Yes, the ship could still fight and fight hard. She had helped drag a major enemy effort to retake Guadalcanal toward failure by tearing apart the backbone of its sea reinforcement. Yet the story of her survival and the wider campaign was not finished. Somewhere ahead, beyond the glow of that hard-won success, lay more patrols, more repairs, and new crises that would again test whether Enterprise truly was the ship that refused to die.